You've met this person. You might even be this person. They don't dominate the conversation. They don't perform. They sit there, mostly listening, occasionally nodding, and somehow, by the end of the night, they've figured out everyone in the room. What you're afraid of, what you actually want, the gap between what you said and what you meant. And the loud ones, the ones who filled every silence, they walked away thinking they made an impression. They have no idea they were being read the entire time. Here's what psychology actually says about that quiet person, and why calling them shy might be the most dangerous misread you'll ever make. If this is you, the one who listens more than you speak, you already know something the others don't. You've probably known it for years. You sit in a room and you feel everything. The tension under the small talk, the performance behind the confidence, the loneliness underneath the loudest laugh. And people have probably called it shyness, introversion, maybe even awkwardness. They gave it a label that made it sound like a deficit, but you've always suspected there was something else going on, that the quiet wasn't weakness, that you were doing something in those silences that other people couldn't see. You were right. In the 1950s, a psychologist named Solomon Asch ran a simple experiment. He put people in a room and asked them to match the length of lines on a card. Straightforward, obvious answers. But there was a catch. Everyone else in the room was a Confederate giving deliberately wrong answers out loud. Around 75% of participants caved at least once. They said the wrong answer out loud because the social pressure of the room was louder than their own perception. But a small group didn't. They sat quietly, nodded, and still gave the correct answer. Asch called the ones who resisted independent. But what he noticed and rarely talked about was that they weren't the loudest people in the room either. They were the ones who had learned somewhere along the way to trust what they observed over what they were told to perform. That capacity to see clearly without needing to announce it is exactly what we're talking about today. The first thing to understand is that quiet people are not less engaged. They're processing at a different depth. Neuroscience has a name for this. It's related to something called sensory processing sensitivity. Research by psychologist Elaine Aron found that roughly 15 to 20% of people have a nervous system that processes environmental stimuli more thoroughly than average, deeper, longer, more completely, which means they're not sitting there zoning out. They're sitting there taking everything apart. And this is where it gets interesting. When a quiet person doesn't respond immediately, it's often because their brain is still working the problem. They're running the scenario forward, checking it from multiple angles. The loud person has already given you their first thought. The quiet person is giving you their third. Here's the quiet irony of that. In a culture that rewards whoever speaks first, we've confused output speed with intelligence. Most people do, but the quiet person figured that out a long time ago, and they stopped playing the game.
There's a concept in psychology called hypervigilance, a state of heightened alertness where the nervous system is constantly scanning for threat or change. Now, in its clinical form, it's associated with trauma, but in its milder version, it produces something remarkable. People who've spent their whole lives in rooms where they felt slightly out of place, slightly other, develop an extraordinary ability to read them. They notice the micro-expression that flickers across someone's face before the smile sets. They hear what's left out of a sentence. They feel the energy in a room shift before anyone else has registered that something changed. If you've ever walked into a gathering and immediately known, before a single word was said, that something was off, you know exactly what this feels like. Most people call this being sensitive. Researchers call it something closer to a sophisticated threat detection system that also happens to decode other humans with unusual accuracy. That's not a quirk, that's a skill, and some people have spent 20 years sharpening it without realizing it had a name. Most people confuse being quiet with having nothing to say, but people who think the way you do, they've usually chosen to say nothing, and that's a completely different thing. There's a principle in behavioral psychology called the Dunning-Kruger effect, the finding that people with limited knowledge in an area tend to overestimate their competence, while people with genuine expertise often underestimate themselves. The person who talks the most about a subject is frequently the one who knows the least, and the person sitting quietly at the back of the room saying almost nothing, they've usually seen through the conversation. They know what's missing. They're just waiting to see if anyone else notices. The truly dangerous part, and I mean this, is that people underestimate them constantly. And the quiet person, they let that happen deliberately. Because being underestimated is a form of power that nobody ever talks about in leadership books. Here's the thing about silence that psychology gets exactly right. It is not the absence of communication. It is a specific kind of communication. Research on negotiation, particularly the work coming out of behavioral economics, consistently shows that the person who speaks last, who lets the silence breathe, who waits, holds disproportionate power in any exchange. The discomfort of silence pressures most people into filling it, and in filling it, they reveal things they never meant to share. The quiet person figured this out, maybe not consciously, maybe through years of watching conversations unspool and noticing who always talked themselves into corners. And so they learned to wait, not because they had nothing to say, but because timing a truth well is worth 10 unfiltered ones. That's not passivity, that's precision. Now, here's the part that's less flattering to romanticize, because quiet people carry something the loud ones don't always have to. A concept called rejection sensitivity dysphoria describes an intense emotional response to perceived rejection or criticism that can be felt almost physically, and it disproportionately affects people who are deeply perceptive, because the same nervous system that makes you good at reading rooms makes you very, very aware when you're being dismissed. So the quiet person at the party who looks unfazed is sometimes working harder than anyone in the room just to stay level. They feel the social temperature acutely. They notice the person who subtly rolled their eyes. They clock the conversation that stopped when they walked over. And most of the time, they absorb all of it without saying a word. That's not easy. Sitting with that kind of awareness and not reacting to it takes a specific kind of internal strength that rarely gets acknowledged because it leaves no visible evidence. Psychologists studying what's sometimes called locus of control have found a consistent pattern. People who develop internal frameworks, who rely on their own observations rather than external social validation, tend to be more resilient over time and more accurate in their assessments of situations. Quiet, deeply perceptive people tend to run internally. They don't need the room to confirm what they've already clocked. They hold their own counsel. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the ones who are the most dangerous, in the best possible sense, aren't dangerous because they're cold or calculated. They're dangerous because they see you completely, and they're kind enough not to say it out loud unless they have to. Robin Williams was famously like this off stage. Behind the extraordinary output of energy was a man his close friends described as almost unnervingly perceptive, someone who would notice the one person in a crowd who was struggling and go directly to them, quietly, without performance. That sensitivity was the engine of his genius, and also the thing that cost him the most. The gift and the weight are the same thing, always. So here's what we've actually been talking about this whole time, and it's not shyness. It was never shyness. What we've been describing is a specific neurological and psychological profile, heightened sensory processing, finely calibrated social intelligence, a practiced capacity for patience, and an internal compass that doesn't need outside approval to stay oriented. The science doesn't frame this as a deficit, it frames it as a variant, one that in certain environments, certain relationships, certain high-stakes moments is a genuine advantage. The word quiet was always too small for what this actually is. You were never the person with nothing to say. You were the person who understood the cost of saying the wrong thing and chose not to pay it. I want to say one thing directly to you before this ends. If you've spent years feeling slightly out of phase with a world that rewards volume and speed, if you've been told you're too quiet, too serious, too in your head, those weren't criticisms of a flaw, they were descriptions of a frequency most people don't operate on. You have spent your life in rooms, learning them, reading them, sitting in the discomfort of your own awareness and not flinching. That is not nothing. And the part that nobody tells you, the world is actually not short of loud people. It is genuinely short on people who know how to be still enough to see clearly. That's you, and it always has been. If this video described something you felt but never quite had words for, that's exactly what this channel is here for. Not self-help, not generic advice, the actual psychology behind why people like you experience the world the way they do. Psychologists have a name for you, and there are entire fields of research built around understanding how you think, what you need, and why you move through the world differently. Subscribe, because the next video goes somewhere this one only opened the door to. And if you've made it this far, you are always going to want to know what's behind it.